I'll just get right into it, I suppose. So it's all Greek to me, the history, theology, and culture of the Eastern Orthodox Church. For a little bit of background, like Nico said, classicist by training, so I'm not approaching this as a theologian, as a church historian. This is just me doing history and trying to present as clear a picture of these two organizations, institutions, and cultures as I can. So personally, I am agnostic, but I'll try to be as unbiased as possible, so if I ever say anything that's wonky, just throw something at me, I'll get the message. For a little bit of context, this is me at the ripe age of 9 years old at the Parthenon. This was my 5th trip to the Parthenon. It's not fun when you're that young because it's hot. You don't want to be there. It's 9 in the morning. Yeah, not pleasant. My mom is full Greek. She's from a tiny island off the coast of Turkey. She had me baptized Greek Orthodox, which is words that I didn't understand. What is adox and why is it ortho? Mysteries that I didn't really know until very recently. So, let's see. To basically explain a little bit of context as to what the Greek experience is like in a nutshell. I'll take us to a familiar setting, the Easter Vigil on Saturday night. With Catholicism and in the Eastern Orthodox Church, there's a lot of stuff with the Holy Flame and a very beautiful and somber service with that ceremony, that holiday. The funny thing with Greek Orthodox masses is that instead of just kind of putting the flame away, maybe extinguishing it as you leave, you have to take it back to your house and do a cross on your roof, which is difficult when it's windy. So what usually happens is that you have a very nice service, and everyone's singing, and it's really beautiful, God is reborn. But then everyone leaves, and it just turns into a total slapstick routine. So you're really trying to keep it together and stay, proper. And people are yeah, I gotta go back because that goes out. You have to get it again. You have to take it back to your car. And it's really funny, for lack of a better word. It's just the complete dichotomy. As soon as everyone leaves, it's just a free for all. So for most of my life as a Greek person, this is what I thought Christianity was supposed to be. And that's clearly not it, because that's the only service my mom really took me to, so I thought, this is what it is, and it was not. So I learned a lot more later. Very narrow perspective there. Whoops. So what exactly is the Eastern Orthodox Church getting out of my comedy routine, actually, into the learning stuff? It's basically a bunch of smaller churches organized together that all, through various means, tie their history to the church established by Constantine the Great in the early 300s AD. So the biggest branches are Greek, Russian, and Oriental or Coptic, though they're a little bit different. We'll talk about that later. But essentially, as opposed to Catholicism, which is kind of one huge thing all over with the Pope in the center, it's like the United States of America, but with no federal government. All of the different churches are kind of spread out, mostly doing versions of their own thing without an overarching government to tie it together like what we have in Catholicism. Not exactly how it works, but broadly speaking, that's the main difference in the organization. So the big difference that most people think of, what's going on between these two, is the difference in Easter, because it's all over the place. Catholic Easter happens, and Greek Easter happens whenever it wants to happen. Sometimes it's the same, sometimes it's totally different. The reason that they changed when they used to be the same Easter calendar dating is because the Julian calendar, established by Julius Caesar in the 50s BC before he got tried to make the calendar work, make it uniform, and it was pretty good. But in the 1500s, we said, actually, we can fix this a little bit, we can tweak it, we can make it better, more accurate. So the Catholic Church works on the Gregorian calendar, which has leap days and stuff like that. So it's more accurate to the way that the sun and everything actually works. But the Orthodox Church still remains with the Julian calendar. Sometimes it's revised, but because of that, that accounts for some of the differences in how Easter is calculated. The formula is basically after the vernal equinox, after the first full moon, that Sunday is Easter. So the Greek Orthodox Church tries to tie it to the Jewish Passover service and that celebration, but Catholicism tended towards what the calendar says will make it work. So different priorities with accuracy to the sun versus accuracy to old traditions, and just it's different. It makes so little sense looking at it. It's like, it's the same, it's different. It's the same, it's a mess. A big thing you can look at with Orthodox churches in general is the architectural styles. There are a lot of really different ones all over the place. So this is a church in Sofia, Bulgaria. This is a Coptic church in Cairo, the Church of St. Mark. Both Orthodox churches, but very different styles. Next, we have the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow, which is actually rebuilt fairly recently. And this is a very classically styled church in Athens that just finished a bunch of restoration a couple years ago because there was an earthquake in the 70s, and they tried to restore it, and they ran out of money because it's Greece. They just opened it up, and it's really beautiful. So, yeah, truth hurts, I know. The main formula that all the Orthodox churches really evolved from and split up into their own kind of different schools of architecture was the Church of Hagia Sophia, or Hagia Sophia, if you speak Turkish, if you're like that. Where the main structure, minus the minarets, which came later, is a big central dome, compact design, as opposed to more Catholic churches, which are usually long nave, triangular roof, cross steeples, and all that stuff, towers usually. So obviously there's no set formula for how to do it, but usually the mark of an Orthodox church is that dome, because that really is the center. Until like the 1500s, this was the highest unsupported dome in the world until the Duomo in Florence came around. It's a miracle it hasn't been destroyed. I'll get to that later too. So that's basically the formula for how architecture works. Another thing that you might notice about the differences between the Eastern Orthodox churches and Catholic churches is cross design. What's up with this? That's 3 too many bars. What's going on? So the thing is, this is usually the cross that you'll find associated with Russian Orthodox churches. Here is the main crossbar. Up here is the INRI, Jesus Christ, King of the Jews, or Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews in Latin. I don't know it off the top of my head. And this is the footstool, which they show at a diagonal. I think it conveys it. It's hard to do depth in 2D, but I think it works. This is a Greek cross, which is just a plus sign. And this is the Orthodox cross in general for kind of all of the churches, which just has the kind of ornate clubbed features. And a trend that you'll realize is that a lot of Orthodox architecture and design and art style is just like Catholic art, but way more. And we'll see a little bit more of that later. So the Orthodox church hierarchy, like I was explaining a little bit earlier, the authority doesn't necessarily derive from the Pope and Rome and that tradition that's tied to St. Peter. It derives from an ongoing process of ecumenical councils that were held over the course of several hundred years. The most recent one was like, 2 years ago or something, to hammer out the orthodoxy or the right way, ortho meaning correct and doxa meaning like an opinion, a way of thought, to practice the church. So the first ecumenical council was, I'll talk about this a little bit later, the Council of Nicaea, where they decided Trinitarian Christianity is the way we're going to do it. So for the Orthodox Church, every different branch has their own kind of internal hierarchy, internal authority. It's described as autocephalous, so it's its own head. So the Greek church does its own thing, the Russian church does its own thing, but their common ground is derived from these councils, like having a constitutional convention every 50 years instead of just having the one constitution and running with it. So a little bit of a different setup, but broadly speaking, let's see. Oh, yeah, so the original plan for how the church was supposed to be set up was to have 5 patriarchs in charge of different apostolic or episcopal sees. There was Rome, Jerusalem, Alexandria, Antioch, and Constantinople, of like the 5 kind of places that are like the archbishops, basically, except there's no pope on top of them as the setup. 2 main differences: leavened bread instead of unleavened bread. And they've all got killer beards. It's really impressive. Those guys never shave. This is, of course, Pope Francis. This is Patriarch Bartholomew of the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, so kind of like their version of the Vatican. He's the guy at the moment. No adoration of the Eucharist in the Eastern Orthodox Church. No rosaries. Instead, they use knotted prayer ropes. Most Greek people have some variety of it on their wrist or along their neck. And no statues in the Eastern Orthodox Church. That's a big historical hullabaloo we'll get to a little bit later, but in the Eastern Church, it's a lot of idols, smaller painted things, because the idea is statues are a little too lifelike. It kind of encroaches on God's territory as the creator. So a big deal in the 800s, 900s. That kind of decides. Okay, just icons. That's all we're doing. Baptism. It is scary. It's legitimately scary watching an Orthodox baptism, because like in Catholicism, you pour the water. It's very gentle, very nice. It's like those babies are crying like that. I honestly worry when I see it. My mom kept telling me that I was Greek Orthodox, and when I was an edgy teenage atheist, I said, no, I didn't choose this religion for myself. I was only baptized, I was never confirmed. To my surprise, unlike Catholicism, it turns out that you're confirmed when you're baptized. So here I was thinking I was baptized and never confirmed, but in the Orthodox Church, they go together, so I'm full of Greek Orthodox. Whoops! Turns out she kind of had a point when she said that I was Greek Orthodox after all. So yeah, big difference is gold. Lots of gold. Enough gold to give a Protestant a seizure. It's a really pretty style. It originated with the Byzantine artwork. I'm just going to blow through that. Originated with Byzantine artwork and pretty much stayed on as the dominant design style going forward. So this is a church in Ravenna in Italy, which stayed as sort of Byzantine protectorate through the fall of Rome and a couple other periods. So a lot of Greek churches and Russian churches are just decked out. It's really, really pretty. When you get like Easter Vigil service, those candles off the lights, ooh, it's really nice. Let's see. Yeah, so languages. I'm just going to drink some water so I don't die. Like Catholicism, it used to be done in the old original language until fairly recently. In the case of the Orthodoxy, it was done in the language of the New Testament, which was Koine Greek. And that's why it's sometimes called the Greek Church in general, even though it's a lot of other people besides just Greeks. The difference is that, 10-year-old me had a bad time, especially when the Divine Liturgy is usually about 3 hours long. Unlike Mass, which is an hour, or daily Mass, which is less, you're only allowed to do one Divine Liturgy per altar per priest per day. So it all goes in there. So incense, readings, songs, like everything you say for high masses is like every day in the Orthodox Church. So it's a lot when you don't speak ancient Greek or modern Greek and you're there for 3 hours as 10 years old. It was not fun for me. Another big difference in how the actual services are presented is the altar, and specifically the screen between the rest of the church and the actual altar in the back. The idea with this is that, in addition to having a bunch of really nice art and nice icons of saints and the Holy Family, you're trying to separate and make the distinction between the spiritual world and the divine realm, which is behind the screen, and the physical world that we all inhabit, which is in front of the screen. So the Eucharist is prepared behind the screen, it's brought out. A lot of the other stuff happens back there. So there's a lot of going back and forth in an Orthodox service, which confused me, because people would go back for 10, 15 minutes, and I was thinking, and then they come out with everything and say, oh, okay, it makes sense. So that's a key difference of what you'd actually see in the service. 3 more things. Orthodox priests can be married. My great uncle is a priest. Fasting is way more comprehensive. Basically, half the year you're borderline vegan. And there's no concept of purgatory in the Orthodox Church. We'll get to that later, but it developed separately after they kind of split apart. So with that, history time. This is where I like to just kind of go. So I'm going to try to get through this, and then that'll be the second half of the presentation. But before we move any further, does anyone have any questions so far about services? Yeah.
Yeah. So you talked about like there being a current dividing where like the people are and where like preparation occurs. Mm-hmm. Does that have any like roots like back to Judaism, or is that like, yeah?
I don't actually know. I think that it might be a similar like philosophy behind it, but I don't think that it specifically evolved from that practice. As in, I don't know if it started like that or if they developed it later. So that's a good question, but unfortunately, I can't actually say.
I'm curious about the differences, any comparison you could make between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church when it comes to leadership and the structure of leadership, and whether having a council versus a single pope as head might have anything to do with the having priests be able to marry and any other differences.
That is a very good question. As far as deciding the orthodoxy being concerned, there's about a dozen ecumenical councils between Constantine's Council of Nicaea and now, where they hammered out a bunch of different things. I don't think that those things like priests being able to marry were strictly decided on in those councils. I think it might have just kind of arisen, because the thing with having different autocephalous, basically self-governing churches as opposed to one hierarchy that kind of distributes everything out is, in some ways, it's slower to change, and in some ways it's faster, because some churches can say, oh, we're doing this now because the archbishop in Kiev says we're going to do this. And the rest of the church might say no, in Greece and in Russia and other places, but sometimes you get much slower movement where, because there was no council to say, hey, we're all going to do this now, no one decides to do it, whereas a pope can say, we got this. So new evangelization takes place over basically the papacy of JP2 and then kind of follows after, but changes that swift don't usually occur in the Orthodoxy by contrast. I hope I was able to answer that. Yes?
Okay, this is kind of a weird question,
okay.
But so using leavened bread, what are like the logistics of
I have no idea. I have no idea. I tried to look it up. I do not know. I could not find out why they use leavened bread.
Well, like, my question was like, is this like one chunk of leavened bread we're just like tearing off little bite sized pieces?
Yes.
Or do you have like
yes, exactly.
little baby rolls or something?
It's just like...
No, you get like a big loaf of bread and you cut it up.
Yeah, so there's no not terrible way I can say this. It's like croutons.
Okay.
Yes.
So one is the ecumenical councils. The Roman Catholic Church was also part of all of those ecumenical councils as well. And as far as the leadership questions, in the Orthodox Church, all of the bishops are taken only from the celibate clergy.
Yes,
So
that's correct.
Priests can get married, but if you are married, well, actually, priests cannot get married. Married men can become priests.
That makes more sense. That's right.
But a priest cannot get married. And if you're going to be a bishop in the Orthodox Church, it's taken only from the celibate clergy. And I think the theological reason for the leavened bread is that I think the Orthodox Church kind of says that Christ is it takes it from the gospel, a little bit of leaven helps the whole loaf rise, that whole thing. Christ brings new life to the whole church, and so it opted to use leavened bread. I think that's kind of
That would make sense. I wouldn't be able to say yes or no, but that sounds like a yes.
Do certain like religious ways of life, like monasticism or religious orders, exist within the Eastern Orthodox Church?
Yes, but it's basically all one thing. So instead of having Jesuits and Dominicans and Franciscans, it's basically all Orthodox monks, essentially, follow a very similar set of guidelines. So you may have regional differences based on, a Greek monk might do different things than a Russian monk, but broadly speaking, there aren't hyper-specialized orders in the same way. Anything else? Cool. So, history time. This is the fun part. So we have a Roman Empire. Jesus was the person who lived in it, over here, way on the edge. For context, the Roman world started here, expanded everywhere. It was next to, Judea was next to Egypt, which of course has a very old history, but was ruled by Greeks for about 300 years before then. He's right next to Persian kingdoms, and this part was, of course, the Holy Land for the Jews, but had also been ruled by Greeks. So a very multicultural corner of the Roman Empire for sure. A lot of different things going on in there. But still connected to the entire rest of the Mediterranean. So a very interesting moment in history, having just basically been brought under the Roman wing maybe a couple dozen years before. Philosophically speaking, the early church spread in large part because of that connection to the Greek world that they were in. Greek philosophy, such as the Gospel of John, Christ as Logos, as divine reason itself, is a direct extension of Platonic thought. And it's part of the reason that the early church was able to spread so fast, because with non-Jews, you can still find something appealing about the concept of Christ as the Lord and the Savior and the Word from concepts that you would have already known. So you can read Plato and just think, oh, he's that. Cool, I'm on board. So it was very easy for people to jump on based in the culture that they were working with. And the other Gospels, aside from John, appealed to different types of groups. So Mark was speaking to the Romans, Luke was broadly speaking to the Greeks, Matthew was broadly speaking to the Jewish population. So by playing to the different elements of diversity within the church, there was a lot of very swift progress that was able to be made, which is interesting. I'm going to skip over a lot of the early history of the church, various schisms and different people doing different things, and monophysites and this and that, because it's very complicated and I don't really know what that will, and I'd probably get it wrong. But skipping ahead to Constantine, the important thing to note is that of the three things that he did, which are important for our story, he won this battle, which is the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, after, I think it was an angel that appeared to him in a dream or a vision and said, paint the sign of the Chi-Rho on your shields and you'll win the battle to reunite the Roman Empire. He did. He won. Said, oh, wow, okay. Converted to Christianity, legalized it within the empire, didn't mandate it as the religion, but he legalized it, so he elevated it to a status parallel with the Roman pagan religion. The second thing he did was move the capital from Rome to Byzantium, renaming it Constantinople, because the east was a much richer part of the empire. It was closer to Egypt. It was more manageable when there was some wonkiness going on with Germans coming in and making a mess of things, and the West is just better in the East. So moved it to Constantinople. And the third thing he did, probably the most important for the future of the church going forward, was to hold the Council of Nicaea, where he said, okay, there's a lot of different ideas around here, different people in different places have different thoughts. Let's try to bring this together and get one way to put this out and to organize it. So he developed an orthodoxy, a correct way of practicing Christianity, that at this council decided upon the Trinity, Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So the Nicene Creed, that's this. So in a time before the New Testament was codified, this was basically the foundation of where everyone got a lot of their ideas about how to be a good Christian from. A century later, Emperor Theodosius, at the end of the 300s, mandated Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire. So from Constantine onward, you could be either, but after Theodosius, you had to be Christian or you were getting thrown to the lions. So that got flipped around. Theodosius followed the Nicene Trinitarian Orthodoxy and established that as the way that his empire was to be governed. The contrast here is opposed to a form of Christianity described by the monk Arius, who came from Egypt and then went up that way, who said that no, there's no Trinity. God is God and Jesus is something else. Big no-no. The empire didn't like that, so he went to the Germanic tribes. And his version of Christianity was basically thoroughly condemned throughout the entire empire, and it came back to be a problem later. We're going to get to that. The other big thing he does is divide the empire in two. Western Roman Empire, Eastern Roman Empire. I see no way in which this carefully laid plan can go, oh, no, it's gone. Okay. Splitting Rome in half did not have the desired effect, and the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 as I shed a single tear. From the Eastern perspective, this showed how important it was to maintain orthodoxy, because the barbarians who invaded the Roman Empire were Christians, but they were Arian Christians. They said, oh, no Trinity, God, Jesus, totally different, and that was seen as like, oof, really bad. So the importance of maintaining an orthodoxy in the empire and kind of like influencing around them was seen as an important thing. I'm repeating myself because my notes are confusing. I didn't write this very well. So the other big thing is that with the 4 or 5 episcopal sees of Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, Constantinople, and Rome, these 4 were all good. they were in the empire, they were fine. But Rome was under the thumb of barbarians, so it was different now. It was separate, it was cut off, and that plays through the rest of church history, because after this moment, it gets really hard for the churches to keep in contact. I think I explained this in the next slide, but yeah. One of the big problems was that the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, all spoke Greek. Western Empire, now not an empire anymore, all spoke Latin, so they basically couldn't communicate with each other pretty much at all. So the lanes of communication broke down pretty swiftly. Eastern Church carried on its married way, uninvaded. The Oriental Orthodox Church, Syria, parts of Egypt, broke off for various different theological reasons, but they were still under the umbrella of the Byzantine Empire, so they were still like kind of united, just a little bit different. And the church kind of recognized this as, oh, it's you exercising your autocephaly, your right to decide to do things a different way from us, so long as it's kind of within the orthodoxy. But it was different enough that historians look back at this and say, no, they really split off and did their own thing here. Even though as far as the Roman was concerned, they were all still part of the same Orthodox Church. The next big thing is that Emperor Justinian, coming from here in the 500s, goes way that way, tries to reconquer the old Roman world. It doesn't really work. He was over here for about 5 minutes and then it all came crashing back down. There were pockets that stayed Byzantine and stayed united under the empire. Rome was in there for a while, but for the most part, he tried to put the empire back together, and it just didn't work. He also built Hagia Sophia, the church that I mentioned earlier, and tried to establish that idea of the pentarchy of Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria as the kind of 5 major sites of the church where everything can be organized from, because this was a hugely dense area of population, which is why there's so many over here. Not a lot of people in North Africa. Rome was pretty much it in the West. So that idea of the 5 episcopal apostolic sees really got solidified here. And then changing maps, because I didn't have time to make all the maps, so I just pulled from other ones that I already made. For 2 main reasons, everything gets weird in the 600s. In Italy, all of that nice empire kind of fizzled away, and only this part remained. And it was pretty firmly separated from the East because they didn't speak Greek. So Justinian kind of said, all right, fine, do your own thing. The Pope ended up exercising a lot of spiritual as well as temporal power, so this is the precursor to the independent papal states that comes around a little bit later. But also, over here, this business, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, all got conquered by the emerging Umayyad Caliphate. So suddenly, Constantinople is all by itself, which is not fun. And for the next 400 years, Constantinople is basically holding the course under its empire. Things are all right, but they're pretty much chilling alone. These are all gone. Rome's gone. It's still Christian, but it's becoming more different as time goes on. The annoying thing with Byzantine history is that it's a tricky subject because it sits basically on the opposite end of both fields. So a classicist like me will look at the Byzantines and say, what year is this? It's medieval. Get it out of here. And a medievalist will say, what's the Roman Empire doing in my Middle Ages? Get it out of here. So it kind of gets ignored by both sides, which is unfortunate. But they still had a very prosperous empire. They were still holding ecumenical councils to decide on orthodoxy and try to evolve the beliefs of the church. But they weren't really expanding. They weren't doing a lot else. They were just kind of chilling, which historically speaking is good. It's good to chill. But it just looks stagnant from the outside. So I do say that Byzantine Empire is cool because you basically get a Roman-looking city in the middle of the 1000s AD, but not a lot of other people knew about it because no one spoke Greek, so no one went to Byzantium. People traded, sure, but it was pretty isolated compared to the rest of the world. It's still impressive that it survived for as long as it did, but it wasn't the same kind of unified, world-spanning empire that it was in the early Roman days, which is unfortunate. So now we get to the Great Schism, which is, this is the complicated part. So basically, there are 3 main reasons that the Great Schism ultimately occurred, and then a spark that really set it off. So the 3 main reasons to get to first are tension, just historically speaking. They were separated for a long time. They didn't speak each other's languages. They didn't talk to each other. They had enough things of kind of getting on each other's nerves with just diplomatic mishaps and stuff like that that they said, I'm not really friends with you guys anymore. Second thing is theology. The big differences are the procession of the Holy Spirit, whereas the Greek Orthodox Church said that the Holy Spirit derives from the Father alone. The Catholic Church, in particular, a priest in 1009, said that the Holy Spirit processes from the Father Filioque and the Son, which was a huge theological argument just waiting to explode. So it was a big scandal when the Pope ended up saying this, and that became a huge point of butting heads over the next couple decades. Easter was actually never a factor in this because the calendar thing didn't happen until later, so that's not even a consideration at this point. Basically, Constantinople was happy being the seat of the Byzantine Empire's church, but the Pope in Rome was starting to say, I am the prime leader of the Catholic world. I have the Catholic Universal Church that, acting on the authority of St. Peter as Jesus' guy who has the keys to heaven, Catholic Church was doing its own thing, and the Byzantine Church said, yeah, wait a minute. So it was just an argument waiting to happen over the authority of each church. So the ideas of who was in charge, would the Byzantines say, we're equal, and the Catholics say, no, but I've got St. Peter's keys. It was fundamentally incompatible and just waiting to explode. So schism was sparked by several things, but this guy, Pope Benedict, who was Pope 3 separate times, bunch of debauchery, really didn't make the papacy look good in the mid-1000s. Led to a series of reforms by, what's the Pope's name? Pope Leo IX had a strong period of reforms that followed after that, tried to centralize the church authority, try to make everything nice and good and everyone following the rules. But this ended up having him butt heads with the Patriarch Celularius in Constantinople, who said, you can't tell my churches what to do. So they got into a spat, started yelling at each other. At one point, a cardinal from Rome placed a papal bull of excommunication in the middle of Hagia Sophia, in the middle of High Mass, in the service on the altar, which was them's fighting words, basically excommunicating the entire Byzantine Church, to which they responded, no, you. And then they were not friends anymore after that. So practically speaking, relations didn't really change that much. They still weren't talking to each other. They still weren't, agreeing on a whole lot. But this, historically looking back, is really like the moment when everything kind of collapsed. So it's easy to point to is this big spat as being the real cutoff point. Funnily enough, it was JP2 and Patriarch Bartholomew who finally withdrew those excommunications in 1995. History is slow. This is your Byzantine Empire in the year 1050 doing its thing. And this is the Byzantine Empire with the Seljuk Turks invading everything. This is what we in the history biz like to call Il Grande Oof. And what happened was, look at the time, Deus Vult, let's crusade. The church here appealed to Rome saying, hey, don't know if you saw, but we're kind of toast over here. Can you help us reclaim all of Anatolia for us to have a church and have Christians there? And the Pope said, yeah, if we help you guys reclaim your land, you'll join back up with us and recognize papal supremacy, right? And they said, yeah, I guess, but that crusade didn't actually end up happening for various reasons. Hard to organize armies, it's work, But 20 years later, Pope Urban II managed to convince a bunch of other Europeans at a council in France, hey, we should go retake the Holy Land and also help our good friends the Byzantines along the way, and maybe they'll consider joining back up with us. So that's what they did. They had a crusade. First one worked out pretty well. They burned Jerusalem to the ground, which ended up annoying the rest of their Muslim neighbors, which had more crusades happen afterwards. But the Byzantines got their land back. It was good for another 200 years. I think things are really starting to go on the up and up. Oh, wait, that's right. It went back down. So the Fourth Crusade, this is a bunch of Catholics, and that's Constantinople. How did this happen, you may ask? It's confusing. It involves money. Essentially, church said, hey, another crusade. Let's go get the Holy Land back. And they thought this is good, but we don't have ships. So Venice said, we will give you boats if you, 1, pay us, and 2, let us take some nice relics that we find there to bring back to our church. If you let us establish some trading routes, we'll help you get to the Holy Land. So they said, great. And the armies went along their way down the Adriatic Sea into Greece, and the Venetians said, wait, we need to complete a favor for our friend, the exiled king of the Byzantine Empire. So they put him back on the throne, and then he got kicked back out again. And then the king said, hey, so I told you guys I was going to pay you for reinstating me as the king of the Byzantine Empire. Turns out, since they deposed me again, I don't have money. And before he finished his sentence, the combined armies of Europe sacked Constantinople. It was really bad. A lot of stuff got destroyed. A lot of stuff got taken. The upshot is that a lot of cool Byzantine relics found their way into Europe and kind of helped start the Renaissance. But it's not enough. So that was really bad. And basically signifies the moment where relations between East and West were pretty much permanently soured. So the Great Schism is one thing, but destroying a city is, ooh, yeah. So that pretty much killed it. After 1453, 200 years later, when the Ottomans were able to bowl over Byzantium with no problem because it had already been destroyed, the only episcopal apostolic see really remaining was Rome, or was it? Because Russia shows up at this point. So since the Byzantines are gone, the big seat of Orthodoxy in the East moved from Constantinople kind of up through Kiev and eventually settled in Moscow, which essentially proclaimed itself as the Third Rome, and for a couple hundred years, they were pretty much living the dream. Buildings like this in the 15 or the 1600s, I'm not entirely sure, added a lot of prestige to the city, continued on the Orthodox tradition, just a little bit further north than it was before. But after the Russian church gained autocephalous status, where they could kind of continue on their merry way doing what they wanted, they were pretty much the seat of the church. The Constantinople church was still allowed by the Ottomans, but it had a very diminished role. So pretty much moves up to Moscow as the main seat of power. You can tell if it's a Russian church because they used all of the swatches when painting. That's pretty much that. And then the next thing, I'll be quick because I think I'm getting to the end here, is knock knock, it's the Reformation. Reformation happened. I don't think I need to go over that again. The big difference with the Orthodox Church is they didn't really have a Reformation because no purgatory, no indulgences. Dante helped popularize the concept of purgatory after the schism had happened, after the whole Constantinople business. So there really wasn't that same kind of like, I can't believe the church is doing this, we need to go do our own thing, because Orthodox Church didn't really have a lot of the same problems. Also, since the Orthodox Church in Russia was basically Russia's thing, you couldn't go against the church without also going against the entire Russian state, and the Russian state had armies, where any guy in Europe can say, I'm going to be Protestant, and not really have to worry about the Pope coming to slap him. It really wasn't the same situation in Russia with the Moscow Church. So Orthodox Church, no Reformation, just kind of worked out that way. Lastly, as we fast forward to the present, the Orthodox Church reemerged in Constantinople following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Antioch and Jerusalem were still under their wing until after World War I. Alexandria had kind of become its own thing. They were allowed to do their stuff by the British after the Napoleonic Wars in the 1800s. But Russia kind of diminished in authority after they imploded before World War I. So as we kind of get to the modern world, a lot of stuff's been changing. A lot of Balkan countries developed their own independent autocephalous churches, such as Georgia, Bulgaria, Serbia, Poland, Romania, Albania, and the Czech Republic, and Slovakia. Nice, that's actually a lot of places. Because when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, it collapsed into a bunch of tiny other countries. So that's cool. Lastly, Russia did an oops in 2018 after invading Ukraine, and the church in Constantinople said, that's a bad thing. Russia said, well, okay, goodbye, and cut off communion with the other churches entirely. So if I'm a Greek and I want to go to a Bulgarian church and get communion, I can do that. I can no longer, as a Greek Orthodox person, go to a Russian church and get communion. Moscow says no. So that was a really big deal. They did this because partially Ukraine was granted autocephaly status to start its own church, partially to escape Moscow's orbit, because a lot of the political stuff is the Ukrainians are really Russians. It's okay if we invade them. So having an independent religious center is core to the Ukrainian identity, resisting that Russian encroachment. So I don't want to get too far into politics, but Ukraine as a church, it's pretty. Russia's doing its own thing now. It seems a little bit weird and kind of odd to see a church declare we're out, goodbye, as early as October of last year, but I think it tells us two things. One is that history really never stops moving. I don't think people during the Great Schism really knew what had happened. I think it'll be a while before we realize the gravity of what ended up happening last year and early this year with the Ukrainian church becoming autocephalous and the Russian church saying, "We out." So I think that's going to be a really big thing that people look back to. It's also important to recognize that Russia's decision to sever ties with the rest of the Orthodox churches is probably much more political than it is religious, because the theological grounds are, I don't have a sheet of paper, thin, but politics, that's how it is. Finally, the conclusion. Basically, we've observed some differences. We've looked at the history to try to figure out how we got from point A to point B. Some people ask, why not reunite? If you're friends now, doesn't that seem like a good idea? And while it's true that Pope Francis and, like I showed you in the picture before, Patriarch Bartholomew are very close, they're very friendly with each other. Pope Francis is also trying to reach out to the Russian church as well. He had a meeting with them a couple years back. Bishop Kirill. The question of why not reunite, I think misses the point because it's a difference in purpose. The Catholic Church, Katholu, meaning everything in Greek, is supposed to be universal. Anybody can be Catholic no matter where you're from, no matter what you were before. This is a religion for you. It goes back to John. This is everybody's thing. But with the Eastern Orthodox Church, it's fundamentally trying to do something else. It's territorial. It's imperial. This is the church of Constantine's Roman Empire and the territories that are now where Constantine's Roman Empire used to be, essentially. So the difference between them, I think, implies that to unify them under one thing, regardless of settling all the filioque theological disputes and consolidating whose authority means more, I don't think it would make sense to do that because it's trying to reconcile two fundamentally different things. So, while I think it would be really wonderful if Catholics and Orthodox Christians could share communion, go to each other's services, I think there's some difficulties in that, but I think it's doable. Give it 100 years. I don't think that it would be a good idea to reunite because, in a weird way, Orthodox Christianity is kind of like Judaism, where it's almost more of a cultural fixture than a pure religion. So Catholicism can kind of adapt to wherever it goes, but Orthodox Christianity is really deeply tied to national roots. So when I say I'm Greek Orthodox, that Greek isn't just there by an accident. It's a part of the culture that I'm from. So it's a really important part of that. So it's the question of, a universal come one, come all, or trying to fit into a national heritage. So this next thing I'm about to say is absolutely not a church-sanctioned opinion, but I think that in my mind, the balance between Catholicism and the Orthodoxy almost mirrors the Eastern and Western Roman empires. It's almost another kind of autocephalous thing where Catholics can do what they want, the Orthodox Church can do what it wants, and as long as they're friends, that's good, but trying to fit them together just would trample or swish out the rich history and the rich culture of each. So I think it's actually more important for Christianity that both options exist for people. And I don't know if the Pope would agree with me, I don't know if the Patriarch would agree with me, but as a historian, I look at the situation that we're in nowadays and I see the Eastern and Western Roman Empire like nothing's changed 2,000 years later. So, again, not a church-sanctioned point of view, but what can I say? I'm a Roman imperial kind of guy, so that's my deal. Finally, any questions? That's a picture of the church in Chicago that I go to. It's really pretty. Okay, then lastly, I would like to lead us in the Lord's Prayer in Greek. It's cool. So, let's see. Can I read that? Oh, no, I can't read that. The type is small. No, it's gone.
Yeah, that's the only reason.
Okay, let's try this. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Pateremon, uendis uranis.
Ayastito tonomasu, el teto i dasiliasu, genitito to thelimasu, osuranano ke pritismis, donato monta piusion, dosim insimeron, gafes imita afirmataimon, osque mis affirmatus filetissimon, que mis negisimas inspiranton, alarise massa potuporilu. Amen.